What happens when a member of the British royal family faces off against one of America's most seasoned journalists in a battle of wills that nobody saw coming? You won't believe what unfolds when Prince Harry sits down with George Stephanopoulos on Good Morning America, expecting a friendly chat about his charitable work, only to find himself in the crosshairs of the most intense grilling of his media career. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when royal privilege meets journalistic integrity in what can only be described as a complete meltdown on live television. The tension was palpable from the moment Prince Harry walked onto the GMA set last night. What was supposed to be a promotional appearance for his latest Invictus Games initiative quickly transformed into something far more explosive. Stephanopoulos, known for his no-nonsense approach and decades of experience grilling politicians and celebrities alike, had clearly done his homework. As the cameras rolled and the studio lights blazed, viewers across America were about to witness a confrontation that would leave the Duke of Sussex questioning whether he should have ever agreed to this interview in the first place. The opening pleasantries lasted exactly 47 seconds. Stephanopoulos welcomed Harry with his trademark professional smile, but those who know the veteran journalist could see something different in his eyes tonight. There was a sharpness, a calculated intensity that suggested this wasn't going to be another softball celebrity interview. Harry, dressed in his usual business casual attire, seemed relaxed initially, flashing that famous Windsor smile as he settled into the guest chair. He had no idea what was coming. "Prince Harry, thank you for joining us tonight," Stephanopoulos began, his voice carrying that familiar authoritative tone that has made him a household name in American journalism. "Let's start with the Invictus Games, but I think our viewers are more interested in something else entirely. Your recent statements about the American media landscape have raised quite a few eyebrows, particularly your criticism of how American journalists operate compared to their British counterparts." The smile on Harry's face flickered for just a moment. This wasn't the opening he had expected. His media handlers had assured him this would focus on his veteran support work, not venture into the murky waters of press relations. "Well, George, I think there's been some misunderstanding about what I actually said. The context was quite different from how it's been reported." Stephanopoulos leaned forward slightly, a gesture that regular viewers know signals his transition from pleasantries to serious journalism. "The context seemed pretty clear when you told the Los Angeles Times that American journalists lack the sophistication and historical understanding that British reporters bring to royal coverage. You specifically mentioned that American media tends to sensationalize rather than inform." That's a direct quote from your interview last month. Harry's posture shifted imperceptibly. The casual confidence he had walked in with was already beginning to crack. "I think you're taking that somewhat out of context, George. What I was trying to express was that there are different journalistic traditions between our countries, and sometimes those differences can lead to misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings?" Stephanopoulos repeated, his eyebrows raising slightly. "You called American journalism shallow and suggested that we don't understand the nuances of royal protocol. For someone who has built his new life in America, who has profited considerably from American media platforms, and who regularly appears on American television shows, that seems rather hypocritical, doesn't it?" The word hypocritical hung in the air like a challenge. Harry's jaw tightened visibly, and viewers could see his hands grip the armrests of his chair slightly tighter. This was not going according to plan. "I wouldn't characterize it as hypocritical, George. I think I'm uniquely positioned to observe the differences between media cultures, having experienced both extensively." Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down. His decades of experience had taught him to recognize when a guest was on the defensive, and he pressed his advantage. "Uniquely positioned? Let's talk about that position. You've made millions from Netflix deals, Spotify contracts, and book sales, all facilitated by what you call shallow American media. You've appeared on Oprah, on late-night talk shows, and now you're here with us. If American journalism is so inferior, why do you keep coming back for more?" The studio fell silent except for the low hum of the cameras. Harry's media training had prepared him for difficult questions, But this felt different. This felt personal. Stephanopoulos wasn't just asking questions, he was building a case, methodically dismantling Harry's public persona piece by piece. "I think you're oversimplifying my comments," Harry replied, his voice carrying a slight edge now. The boyish charm that usually served him so well in interviews was nowhere to be found. "My criticism wasn't about individual journalists or specific outlets. It was about systemic differences in how stories are approached and reported." Systemic differences. Stephanopoulos nodded slowly, as if considering the phrase. "Like the systematic way British tabloids invaded your privacy, drove your mother to distraction, and ultimately contributed to the circumstances of her death. Those systemic differences?" Harry's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Mentioning his mother was crossing a line, and everyone in the studio knew it. The producers in the control room could sense the shift in energy, the way the interview was moving from professional discourse into something much more volatile. "That's exactly the kind of sensationalism I was talking about," Harry shot back, his voice rising slightly. "Using my mother's death to score cheap points in an interview. That's precisely what I meant about American media lacking nuance." Stephanopoulos remained completely calm, his expression unchanged. "I'm not sensationalizing anything, Prince Harry. I'm pointing out the irony. You've spent years criticizing British media for their treatment of your family, and rightfully so in many cases. But now you're suggesting that American media, which has largely given you a platform to tell your story without the same level of intrusion, is somehow inferior. It seems like you're criticizing the very system that has allowed you to rebuild your public image." The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable. Harry's carefully constructed media persona was cracking under the pressure of Stephanopoulos' relentless questioning. The veteran journalist had found his target and was methodically breaking down every defense the Duke had prepared. "You don't understand the full picture," Harry said, his voice carrying a note of frustration that viewers rarely heard from him. "There are complexities to this situation that go beyond simple media criticism. The American press has been generally fair to me, yes, but that doesn't mean I can't observe differences in journalistic standards and approaches." "Journalistic standards?" Stephanopoulos seized on the phrase immediately. "Let's talk about standards. Is it up to journalistic standards to criticize an entire nation's media while simultaneously profiting from it? Is it standard practice to bite the hand that feeds you while asking for seconds?" The confrontation was reaching a boiling point, and both men knew it. What had started as professional disagreement was becoming something much more personal, much more dangerous for Harry's carefully managed public image. And as viewers would soon discover, this was only the beginning of what would become one of the most explosive television moments of the year. But Stephanopoulos wasn't finished. In fact, he was just getting started. The veteran journalist had spent 30 years in television, from his early days in the Clinton White House to his current position as one of America's most respected news anchors. He had faced down presidents, prime ministers, and world leaders. A disgruntled prince was not going to intimidate him, especially not on his own show. "Let me ask you something else, Prince Harry," Stephanopoulos continued, his voice maintaining that steady, professional tone that somehow made his words even more cutting. "You've spoken extensively about your mental health struggles, and I respect that. But you've also monetized those struggles through book deals, streaming contracts, and speaking engagements. How do you reconcile your criticism of media exploitation with your own willingness to exploit your personal trauma for financial gain?" The question hit Harry like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and for a moment, he seemed genuinely speechless. This wasn't just professional criticism anymore. This was a direct attack on his character, his motivations, and his integrity. The carefully crafted narrative he had built around his departure from royal life was being systematically dismantled in real time. "That's completely different," Harry stammered, his composure finally beginning to crack completely. "Sharing my story to help others who might be struggling is not the same as media exploitation. I've been transparent about my experiences to break down stigma and encourage people to seek help." Stephanopoulos nodded slowly, but his expression remained skeptical. "Transparent, yes, but also profitable. Your book Advance alone was reportedly worth $40 million. Your Netflix deal is valued at over $100 million. These aren't charitable endeavors, Prince Harry. These are business transactions. You're selling your trauma, your family's secrets, and your royal connections to the highest bidder, while simultaneously criticizing the media for doing exactly the same thing. The studio audience, which had been silent throughout the interview, could feel the electricity in the air. This was no longer a celebrity interview, it was a public execution. Harry's hands were visibly shaking now, and his usually perfect media training seemed to have completely abandoned him. "You're twisting everything I've said," Harry replied, his voice rising to a level that was clearly audible to viewers. "I never said I was doing this purely for charitable reasons. But there's a difference between sharing your own story and having it stolen and twisted by tabloids who don't care about the truth." "Is there?" Stephanopoulos shot back immediately. "Because, from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're doing exactly what you accuse the British tabloids of doing. You're taking private family moments, personal conversations, and intimate details about people who can't defend themselves, and you're broadcasting them to the world for money. The only difference is that you're cutting out the middleman." Harry's face was now completely flushed, and viewers could see a vein pulsing in his temple. "That's not fair, George. My father and brother have had their chance to speak publicly. They have the entire British establishment backing them up. I've been vilified and silenced for years." "Silenced?" Stephanopoulos' voice carried a note of incredulity that was impossible to miss. "You've been on more American television shows in the past 3 years than most celebrities manage in a decade. You've written a best-selling book, you have your own podcast, and you're constantly giving interviews. If this is what being silenced looks like, I think most people would sign up for it." The exchange was becoming increasingly heated, and both men seemed to be forgetting that they were on live television. Harry was no longer the polished media personality who had walked onto the set an hour earlier. He was becoming defensive, angry, and most dangerously for his public image. Entitled, "You don't understand what it's like," Harry said, his voice carrying a whining quality that made him sound petulant rather than sympathetic. "You don't know what it's like to have your entire life scrutinized, to have every word twisted, to be constantly under attack." Stephanopoulos leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since the interview began, he smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just cornered his prey. "Actually, Prince Harry, I do know what that's like. I spent years in the White House during some of the most controversial moments in American political history. I've been attacked by Republicans and Democrats alike. I've had my integrity questioned, my motives challenged, and my professional competence criticized on a daily basis. The difference is, I didn't run away to another country and spend years complaining about it on television." The comparison was devastating, and everyone in the studio knew it. Harry had been positioned as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, but Stephanopoulos had just pointed out that plenty of people face similar scrutiny without abandoning their responsibilities and monetizing their grievances. "That's completely different," Harry protested, but his voice lacked conviction now. "You chose to enter politics. I was born into this. I never had a choice." "Neither did your brother," Stephanopoulos replied instantly. "Neither did your father. Neither did your grandmother before she died. They all faced the same pressures, the same scrutiny, the same challenges, but they stayed and did their duty. You left and wrote a book about how hard it was. So tell me, who really lacks character here?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Harry's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. He was completely out of his depth, facing a level of journalistic scrutiny that his carefully managed media appearances had never prepared him for. The prince, who had spent years controlling his narrative, was discovering what it felt like to lose that control completely. "I think," Harry finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, "that you're being deliberately unfair and hostile. This isn't journalism. This is a personal attack." Stephanopoulos' expression didn't change, but there was something almost predatory in his stillness. "This is journalism, Prince Harry. This is what real accountability looks like. You've spent 3 years appearing on friendly platforms, giving softball interviews, and controlling your message. You've forgotten what it's like to face genuine scrutiny. And frankly, Your reaction to these perfectly legitimate questions tells us everything we need to know about why you really left the royal family." The words hit Harry like a sledgehammer, and viewers could see the exact moment when his carefully constructed facade finally began to completely collapse. For several seconds, the studio was completely silent. Harry stared at Stephanopoulos with a mixture of shock, rage, and something that looked dangerously close to panic. His media training, his years of carefully managed public appearances, his entire strategy for rebuilding his image in America, all of it was crumbling in real time under the relentless pressure of genuine journalistic scrutiny. "You want to know why I really left?" Harry's voice was barely controlled now, trembling with barely suppressed fury. "You want to know the real reason? It's because of people like you. Journalists who think they have the right to dissect every aspect of someone's life, to judge decisions you couldn't possibly understand, to act as if you know better than the people actually living through these experiences." Stephanopoulos remained completely calm, his hands folded on his desk, his expression unchanged. "So, it wasn't about racism in the royal family. It wasn't about your mental health. It wasn't about protecting your wife and children. It was about avoiding accountability? About not wanting to face difficult questions?" The accusation was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Harry's composure completely evaporated, and for the first time in the interview, viewers saw the real man behind the carefully crafted public persona. Gone was the sympathetic victim of royal protocol and media intrusion. In his place sat an entitled, angry man who was furious at being challenged. "Accountability?" Harry practically shouted, his voice echoing through the studio. "Accountability to whom? To you? To people who have never lived a day in my shoes? I don't owe you or anyone else an explanation for the choices I've made to protect my family and my sanity." "Actually, you do," Stephanopoulos replied, his voice remaining maddeningly steady. "You owe explanations to the British people who supported the royal family financially. You owe explanations to the American people whose media platforms you've used to rebuild your image. And you certainly owe explanations to the family members you've publicly criticized and embarrassed for profit." Harry stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. The sudden action sent a ripple of tension through the studio crew, and viewers could sense that something unprecedented was about to happen. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice now loud enough that it was almost certainly distorting the audio levels. "This aggressive, hostile interrogation style that passes for journalism in America. You're not seeking truth, you're seeking ratings." Stephanopoulos finally showed the first crack in his professional demeanor, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And you're not seeking to help people with their mental health struggles, Prince Harry. You're seeking to rehabilitate your image while making millions of dollars. At least I'm honest about what I'm doing." The comparison was devastating, and everyone in the studio knew it. Harry was being exposed not just as hypocritical, but as fundamentally dishonest about his own motivations. His entire American media strategy was built on presenting himself as a victim who had courageously spoken truth to power, but under real scrutiny, that narrative was falling apart completely. "I don't have to listen to this," Harry said, his voice shaking with rage. "I don't have to sit here and be attacked by someone who clearly came into this interview with an agenda. This isn't journalism, it's character assassination." "No, Prince Harry," Stephanopoulos replied, standing up slowly to match Harry's posture. "This is what journalism looks like, when the subject can't control the narrative. This is what accountability feels like when you can't buy your way out of difficult questions. And your reaction right now is proving every point I've made about why you really left the royal family." Harry's face was now completely red, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "My reaction? My reaction is to being ambushed by a journalist who clearly has no interest in fair reporting. You've twisted everything I've said, taken my words out of context, and turned what should have been a discussion about helping veterans into a personal attack. I've asked you direct questions about your own public statements and actions," Stephanopoulos countered. "If those questions feel like personal attacks, perhaps you should examine why your own words sound so damaging when repeated back to you." That was the final straw. Harry's composure completely shattered, and viewers witnessed something that had never been seen before on American television: a member of the British royal family having a complete public meltdown. "You know what, George? This interview is over. I don't need this, and I don't need you. I came here in good faith to discuss important work, and you've turned it into a circus." "The only person turning this into a circus is you," Stephanopoulos replied calmly. "I asked legitimate questions about your public statements and business dealings. Your inability to answer them professionally says everything about your character and your fitness for public life." Harry was already moving toward the edge of the set, his microphone pack still attached but forgotten in his fury. "My fitness for public life? I've done more for charity and public service than you ever will. I've served my country in Afghanistan while you were sitting safely behind a desk, asking politicians softball questions." The military service comment was clearly intended to be a devastating blow, but Stephanopoulos didn't even flinch. "You served your country, yes. For 10 weeks in a heavily protected base, with more security than most soldiers see in their entire deployment. And then you left that service, just like you left everything else when it became inconvenient or difficult." Harry stopped moving and spun around, his face contorted with rage. "How dare you minimize my military service? I put my life on the line for my country while you were probably at cocktail parties in Washington." "Your military service was admirable," Stephanopoulos acknowledged. "But it doesn't give you a lifetime pass from criticism, and it doesn't excuse your behavior since then. You can't invoke your 10 weeks in Afghanistan every time someone asks you a difficult question about your multi-million-dollar media deals." Harry's hands were shaking with fury now, and his voice had risen to a level that was becoming genuinely disturbing to watch. "This is unbelievable. This is exactly the kind of toxic media environment that I was talking about. You've proven my point better than I ever could have." "Actually," Stephanopoulos said, his voice still maddeningly calm, "I think I've proven my point. You can handle softball interviews with friendly hosts, but you can't handle real journalism. You can criticize media when you're in control of the message, but you fall apart when faced with genuine accountability." Harry was now at the edge of the set, fumbling with his microphone pack, while studio technicians tried to help him remove it properly. "I'm done with this farce," he announced loudly enough for the entire studio to hear. "I'm done with journalists who think ambush tactics and personal attacks constitute professional behavior. And I think American viewers are done with entitled celebrities who think they deserve special treatment." Stephanopoulos replied, "Thank you for proving exactly what kind of person you really are, Prince Harry." Harry finally freed himself from the microphone equipment and headed toward the studio exit, his face still flushed with anger. "You can edit this however you want, George, but people will see through your agenda. They'll see that you turned what should have been a respectful conversation into a hit job." "We broadcast live, Prince Harry," Stephanopoulos called after him. "There's no editing. What people saw was exactly what happened. A man who can dish out criticism but can't take it, who can attack others but can't defend himself, and who runs away when faced with the kind of scrutiny he's been avoiding for 3 years." Harry paused at the studio door, his hand on the handle, and for a moment it seemed like he might turn around and continue the fight. But instead, he simply shook his head and walked out, leaving behind one of the most explosive television moments in recent memory. Stephanopoulos turned back to the camera, his professional composure completely intact despite the chaos that had just unfolded. "Well, that was certainly illuminating," he said to the viewers. "Sometimes the most revealing interviews are the ones where the guest reveals more than they intended. We'll be right back after this break." As the studio lights dimmed and the cameras stopped rolling, the crew stood in stunned silence. They had just witnessed the complete destruction of a carefully crafted public image, and everyone knew they had been part of television history. Prince Harry's American media strategy had just imploded on live television, and there would be no coming back from this spectacular display of entitlement and thin skin.